He came on a Saturday. I know it was Saturday because I had just come back from the farmer's market 2 blocks from my house, and I was standing at my kitchen counter putting tomatoes into a bowl when I heard the knock. Not the doorbell. The knock. 3 times. Deliberate. The knock of someone who has thought about this moment and practiced it on the drive over. I set down the tomatoes. I already knew who it was. I don't know how I knew. Some combination of instinct and the particular way the knock landed. Certain people have a specific rhythm to the way they want things from you, and you learn it over years without realizing you've learned it. I opened the door. My father was standing on my porch. He looked smaller than I remembered. That's the thing about people you haven't seen in a long time. The image you carry is frozen at the last time you saw them, and 5 years is long enough for reality to diverge significantly. He was wearing a jacket I didn't recognize, holding a hat he wasn't wearing, looking at a point somewhere near my left shoulder. "Nina," he said. "Dad," I said. We looked at each other through the open door of a house that was mine. Completely, legally, without condition. Mine. The deed, the mortgage, the property taxes, every document that said who this place belonged to had my name on it and only my name. I thought about that standing in the doorway because it was the most relevant fact of the moment. And I have always, even in the charged moments, been someone who reaches for the most relevant fact. My name is Nina Reyes. I'm 37 years old, and what I want to tell you about is not the conversation I had with my father on that Saturday, though I will tell you that too. What I want to tell you about is the 5 years that made the conversation possible. There is a version of a story like mine that people tell as a vindication, where the person who was cut off gets to stand in a doorway of something they built and feel the satisfaction of having been right. I want to be honest with you. That is not quite the story I have. The story I have is more complicated and, I think, more true. What I have is a house, and a father standing on the porch of it, and 5 years of choosing myself in the quiet. Not dramatically, not defiantly, just consistently every day in the small decisions that accumulate into a life. That meant, when I opened the door, I was opening it as a person who had ground beneath her feet. That ground. That is what I want to tell you about. This is that story. My father, Marco Reyes, is a man of large ideas and variable follow-through. That is the most honest summary I can offer. He is charming in the specific way that makes people want to give him things, and he has, over the course of his 62 years, accepted what was given with enough gratitude to sustain the giving, and not quite enough accountability to prevent the pattern from repeating. I grew up in a household where money was something that arrived and departed without much relationship to planning. My mother, they divorced when I was 11, had her own version of this quality, though softer and less consequential. What I absorbed, watching both of them, was a very early and very clear understanding that I did not want to live that way. I started working at 16. I tracked every dollar I earned in a small notebook I kept in my nightstand. By the time I graduated from community college and got my first real job in accounts receivable, I had a savings account with $3,000 in it and a mental model of money that had been built entirely in opposition to the one I had been raised inside. I'm telling you this so you understand that when my father came to me in the winter of my 31st year with $74,000 in debt, it was not a neutral event. It was, in the context of my specific history with money and with him, an extremely loaded one. I had said yes to him before, smaller amounts over years. $200 here, $400 there, once a full month's rent when things had gotten particularly tight. I had said yes each time because I could, and because I loved him, and because the ask was always reasonable in isolation. Never large enough individually to require a hard decision. This is how these patterns build, not in one large, unreasonable request, but in a dozen reasonable ones, until the relationship has established a groove, and the groove has a direction, and the direction leads, eventually, to a kitchen table in January and a number that is no longer possible to absorb quietly. The $74,000 was not a surprise when I thought about it honestly. It was the accumulation finally arriving at its logical size. The debt was real. I want to be clear about that. I am not a person who disbelieves in debt or who thinks people who accumulate it are moral failures. Debt happens. What had happened to my father was a combination of a failed business venture, 3 years of optimism that outlasted the actual returns, and a series of decisions that each made some sense in isolation and collectively had produced a number that required outside intervention to resolve. He came to dinner at my apartment. This was January, cold, and he ate the pasta I made and talked about the situation with the mixture of embarrassment and bravado that men of his generation use when discussing financial failure. As though the telling itself were a kind of performance, as though the story of the debt were more manageable than the debt itself. At the end of dinner, he told me the number. Then he told me what he needed. He needed me to take over the debt, to assume it in my name, transfer it formally so that his credit could recover, so that the pressure could be managed by someone with a stable income and good standing. He had a plan, he said. He would pay me back. He had always intended to pay it back, every dollar, once the situation stabilized. He looked at me across my kitchen table with the expression of a man who had calculated that I would say yes. It was not a manipulative expression. I want to be precise about that. It was not calculated to move me. It was simply the expression of a person who had arrived at a conclusion and was waiting for reality to confirm it. He had decided I would say yes, because I had, over 31 years, generally said yes. Because I was the responsible one. Because I was the one with the savings account and the stable job and the good credit. Because I was, in the model he carried of his daughter, the person who could handle things. He was not wrong that I could handle things. He was wrong about what handling things obligated me to. I said no. I want to tell you exactly how it unfolded, because the exact sequence matters more than the general shape of it. I said no at the kitchen table. I said it clearly and without much preamble. I told him I loved him. I told him I understood the situation was serious, and I told him I was not going to assume $74,000 of debt that I had not created and that would take years to manage. I told him I could help him find resources, credit counseling, debt restructuring, options that didn't require me to put my own financial stability at risk. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "I see." Those 2 words, in the way he said them, contained a verdict. I recognized it. I had heard that tone before. Not often, because I had rarely refused him anything, but in the few times over 31 years that I had not given him what he wanted, there had been this specific quality to his response, a withdrawal, a reclassification. He left shortly after. He thanked me for dinner. He put on his coat with the deliberate movements of a man managing his composure. He called me 3 days later. The call lasted 11 minutes. I know the exact duration because I looked at my phone after, the way you look at something that has just changed shape in your hands. 11 minutes to deliver a verdict on 31 years. He told me he had thought about our conversation. He told me he had expected more, that family meant something, that when people needed help, you helped them, that my refusal had shown him something about who I had become. His voice was controlled and cold in the way that is more cutting than anger. Not hot rage, but the measured withdrawal of someone making a determination. The voice of a man reclassifying something. He said that my priorities were clearly not family. He said he had believed he knew who I was, and he had been shown otherwise. He said this without self-pity and without cruelty, which almost made it harder. It had the quality of a verdict delivered cleanly, without malice, which is somehow worse than malice. At the end of the 11 minutes, he said, "I think it's better if we take some space. You are clearly prioritizing yourself over this family, and I need to be around people who understand what family means." I said, "Okay, Dad." He said, "You should know. As far as I'm concerned, until you're ready to act like family, you're not family." The line went quiet, not silent. I could hear him breathing, the ambient noise of wherever he was, a television somewhere, low, traffic. "Okay," I said again. He hung up. I stood in my apartment holding the phone. Outside my window, the city was doing what cities do in January. Gray sky, bare trees, the particular indifference of a world that doesn't adjust its pace for anyone's 11-minute phone calls. I thought about the $74,000. I thought about what it would have meant to put my name on it. The years, the hit to my own credit, the position it would have placed me in, holding a debt I had not created and had no guarantee of ever seeing returned. I thought about the $3,000 I had saved at 18, working double shifts at a coffee shop, and the discipline it had taken and what it had represented. The specific statement it had been to a 16-year-old watching her parents navigate money like weather, that she could make different choices. I thought about all of that, and I put the phone on the counter and went to my desk and opened my laptop and started researching first-time homebuyer programs in my county. I had been thinking about buying a house for 2 years. I had been saving for it. I had been waiting for a moment that felt like the right time. I decided, standing in my apartment at 31 years old, that this was the right time. I want to be honest with you about what those 5 years felt like. They were not triumphant. I want to say that clearly before I tell you what they contained, because the versions of stories like this that get told too often have a quality of clean resolution. The person is freed. They flourish. They don't look back. My experience was less tidy than that. There were Christmases that were genuinely hard. I had built a small, close network of friends. Paloma, who I had worked with for 6 years and who had a way of appearing with food at exactly the moments that required food. Marcus, my oldest friend from childhood, who knew my father and who said, when I told him what had happened, "Nina, you've been bailing him out in smaller ways your whole life. This is just the first time the number was too big to hide from." There was my Aunt Cecilia, my father's younger sister, who called me approximately twice a year with updates I hadn't asked for, and who made clear, in her careful way, that she thought my father had handled the situation badly. But there were still the holidays that landed with a particular weight, the absence of him, not because I missed the dynamic, I didn't, not exactly, but because fathers are a specific presence and their absence has a specific quality, and I am a person who feels things clearly and doesn't pretend otherwise. I bought the house 8 months after the phone call. The process took longer than I expected. Buying a house alone at 31 is an exercise in encountering all the ways systems assume a second person exists. Loan officers who phrase things in the plural, forms that had fields for co-borrower information. The moment at the title company when the woman across the desk looked at the paperwork and said, "And your husband will be," and I said evenly, "There is no husband, just me." And she adjusted without comment, and we continued. I signed every document with my name, and only my name, in the quiet office of a real estate attorney on a Thursday afternoon. Paloma was beside me. I had asked her to come, and she had driven 40 minutes and brought coffee and sat through 2 hours of paperwork with the patience of a good friend who understands that some moments require a witness even when nothing dramatic is happening. When it was done, the attorney handed me a key. Paloma took a photo. I looked slightly dazed in that photo, which is accurate. I was dazed, not with doubt, but with the specific vertigo of a thing you have been working toward for a long time, finally arriving and requiring you to be present for it. The house is a 3-bedroom in a neighborhood chosen for the farmer's market and the school, and the particular light on the back garden in the afternoons. I fixed it up slowly. I painted every room a color I had chosen and reconsidered and chosen again. I pulled up the carpet in the front bedroom and found hardwood underneath that needed refinishing. I spent a weekend on it with a rented machine that was harder to operate than the instructions suggested, and the floor came out better than I expected, which I took as a kind of argument for attempting things. I built the garden the second summer. Tomatoes first because they felt like the right beginning. Then peppers. Then herbs I kept forgetting to water, but which seemed, mostly, to manage. I was promoted at 32 and again at 34. Not because I worked harder in those years than before. I had always worked hard. But because the energy I had previously distributed into managing relationships that cost more than they returned was, for the first time, available for other things. I am someone who does not waste available energy. I noticed its presence, and I used it. At 35, I started doing financial coaching on the side. Informally at first, a friend asked for help with her budget, then she mentioned me to someone, then that person to someone else. By 36, I had registered a small practice, part-time alongside my day job, 4 clients initially, then 12. The people who came to me were often people in situations that rhymed, in various ways, with my father's. People who had borrowed from family and weren't sure how to talk about it. People who had been asked to absorb someone else's consequences and had said yes and were now managing the weight of that. People who had said no and were navigating the aftermath. I found I could work with all of them without judgment. This surprised me. I had thought my own history might make the familiar patterns difficult to sit with. Instead, they clarified things. I could see the shape of what had happened very quickly, and I had learned at 31 across a kitchen table exactly where the line between helping and enabling ran. That knowledge made me useful in a specific way. I also found, working with these people, that I had more sympathy for my father than I expected. Not for the choice he had made. The choice to use family language as leverage to make my no a betrayal, but for the situation that had produced the ask, the shame of the debt, the specific vulnerability of a person who has built an identity on largeness and generosity and confidence arriving at a moment that contradicts all of it. I understood that. I had grown up watching it build. The understanding did not change what I had decided. It complicated how I held it. My Aunt Cecilia called in the 3rd year. She said my father had found his footing. The debt was being managed. He had engaged with the credit counseling. He was working. He asked about me sometimes, she said. I thanked her. I did not ask her to tell me more. She called again in the 5th year. Her voice was different. More careful the way people sound when they are carrying something that requires placement. She said my father had been doing some thinking, that he had something he wanted to say, that he had asked whether she thought I would be open to hearing it. I told her, if he wants to say something, he knows where to find me. The address hasn't changed. 3 weeks later, he came on a Saturday. I need to pause here before I tell you about opening that door, because I want you to understand what 5 years had built before he knocked. Not just the house. What was inside the person standing in the house. What it meant that when his knock came, I was not afraid of it. I was not bracing. I was not already running the old calculation of what he needed and what I had, and whether the gap was closable. I was just a woman putting tomatoes in a bowl, in her own kitchen, in her own house. That is what 5 years gives you if you use them honestly. Not hardness, not the absence of feeling, the ground, the knowledge that you will be standing after this because you were standing before it, because you have been standing on your own for long enough to know what standing feels like. If you're in the years between, in the middle of building something after someone told you that you weren't family, drop a comment. Tell me where you are. Because what I'm about to tell you about opening that door is something I needed to hear when I was still in those years, and no one said it to me. So I'm going to say it to you. I let him in. That's the first thing. I want to say it plainly because I think it matters that I made a choice. I had 5 years of clean space and a house that was mine and no obligation whatsoever to open the door. And I opened it anyway because he was my father. and I had built myself into someone who could make that choice from a place of strength rather than from the old reflexes. We sat in the living room. He looked at the room, at the hardwood floors, the painted walls, the bookshelf I had built from scratch on a YouTube tutorial that had taken 2 weekends and come out slightly crooked in a way I had decided to love. He looked at it the way people look at things they expected to remain static and have instead found transformed. "This is yours," he said, not as a question. "Yes." "You did this." "Yes." He turned his hat in his hands. Same gesture as the porch. He was a man in motion even when sitting still. "I owe you an apology," he said. I waited. He gave it. He gave it fully, which I had not entirely expected. I had prepared myself for the partial version, the one that acknowledges wrongdoing in general terms while relocating the cause to circumstances. He didn't give me that version. He gave me the specific one. He said he had asked me to carry something that wasn't mine to carry. He said he had used the language of family as a weapon when I refused, which was not what family meant, and he knew it. He said he had been ashamed of himself for the debt, and he had redirected that shame outward, onto me, because I was the one who had said no, and no was easier to be angry at than the truth. He said he had thought about the phone call many times in 5 years, about those 11 minutes, about the words he had chosen. "I told you you weren't family," he said. "That was wrong. You were the only one acting like family, telling me a true thing I didn't want to hear." I sat with that for a moment. The living room was quiet. Outside, someone was mowing a lawn. "What happened with the debt?" I asked. He told me. It had taken 3 years of restructuring. He had sold some things. He had moved to a smaller apartment. He had, with the help of the credit counseling program I had pointed him toward. I noticed that he mentioned it, that he knew I had pointed him there. Managed to clear the majority of it. He was not out of the woods entirely. But he was standing in the woods with a map, which was more than he'd had before. "You should have come to me with a map," I said. "Not the whole problem and my name as the solution." He nodded. "I know that now." "You probably knew it then." A pause. "Yes," he said. "I probably did." That honesty cost him something. I watched it cost him. The slight tightening, the working to stay with the discomfort of a true answer instead of retreating to a partial one. He stayed with it. I am my father's daughter in some ways that I do not always acknowledge. The large ideas. I have those too, though I have learned to test them before I act on them. The charm, I have a version of it, quieter and less instinctive but present, and the specific stubbornness of staying in a difficult moment when leaving would be easier. That is his, and I have it, and in the living room that afternoon I watched him use it. I made coffee. We talked for 3 hours, not a reconciliation. I want to be careful with that word because it implies a completion I cannot honestly claim. 3 hours is not 5 years. 3 hours is a beginning of something, if both people choose to make it that, which is not the same as the thing itself. I had learned, in the years since the kitchen table, to be precise about what a moment was and what it wasn't, to not let the relief of resolution collapse the necessary distance between a start and an arrival. We talked about the house. He asked about every room with the interest of a man who was trying to understand something. Not the house itself, but what the house meant, what it said about the person his daughter had become in the years he had not been watching. I showed him the garden. He stood at the back door and looked at the tomatoes and the peppers, which were coming in well that season, and he said, in Spanish, something about my grandmother, that she had kept a garden too in the house in Oaxaca where he grew up, and that tomatoes always smelled the same no matter where you grew them. I did not know about my grandmother's garden. There are things you don't know about people until they decide to tell you, and this was something I hadn't known, and I stood at my back door and let myself want to know more of it. We talked about money, eventually. not about the debt, about money itself, about how he had learned about it growing up, which was to not talk about it, which was the same way I had learned until I had unlearned it. He asked about my coaching practice with genuine curiosity, and I explained it clearly, and he listened with the attention of someone encountering new information. When I described the difference between enabling and helping, he was quiet for a moment. "You learned that," he said, "from me." "Yes," I said, "from watching what it cost you." He received that. He didn't deflect or reframe it. He received it. Before he left, he asked if he could come back, not in the transactional way, not with what he needed, not with a reason, just, "Can I come back?" I said, "I need time to think about what this looks like going forward. I need you to understand that I am not the same person I was at the kitchen table, and I need you to meet the person I am now, not the one you were expecting." He looked at me for a long moment. "I can see she's different," he said. "I'd like to know her." My father comes to the house occasionally, not often, once every few months, with a text before he comes, which was a condition I had named and which he has honored. We are building something careful and slow, which is appropriate for things that have been broken and are not yet fully repaired. He has not asked me for anything. I notice this each time, not because I was waiting for the request, but because the absence of it is its own kind of data, its own evidence that something has shifted in how he understands us. He brought tomatoes from a farmer's market last month, left them on my porch with a note that said, "Thought of Abuela's garden." 3 words in a context I did not have 6 months ago. I put them in the same bowl I had been filling when he knocked the first time. There are things I do not know yet. Whether the carefulness will hold, whether the shift he showed me in the living room is permanent or situational, whether it was who he is now or who he was being for one careful Saturday afternoon, whether the tomatoes on my porch are a beginning or a gesture. I do not know these things. I have stopped, needing to know them in advance. This, too, is something the 5 years gave me. The capacity to let things be uncertain without needing to resolve them prematurely. I had spent a lot of my life doing the opposite, managing uncertainty by reaching forward and constructing conclusions so that I could operate inside a framework rather than in the open space of not knowing. It's a useful skill in accounting and budgeting and in most of the professional contexts I inhabit. In relationships, it is less useful. In relationships, the not knowing is sometimes the appropriate state, and sitting in it without grasping for resolution is a skill I had to learn. I am learning it. Slowly. With the same attention I applied to refinishing the hardwood floor and building the garden and all the other things that required patience and tolerance for results that arrived later than expected and looked different than planned. My father texted last Tuesday. He asked if I had any of last season's tomato, seeds saved. He was thinking of trying a container garden on his apartment balcony. It was a small text, very ordinary, the kind of text that passes between people who are finding their way back to the ordinary territory. I had seeds. I told him I would bring them next time I was near his side of the city. I don't know what we're building yet. I know it's being built carefully, and I know the ground it's being built on is mine, and I know that both of those things are new. That's enough to work with. What I know is what I knew when I opened the door. This is my house. The deed has my name on it. No amount of him being here or not being here changes that. I built it. It is mine. He can visit something I built. That's a different thing from what he asked for at the kitchen table. And it is, I have found, enough. Enough space for something real, built on ground that doesn't shift. That is what 5 years of quiet gave me. Not the house, not the savings account, the career, the garden. The ground. Ground that holds. Ground I own. Ground that was there when he knocked, and was there when I opened the door, and will be there whatever comes next. I want to say something to you before you go. to whoever is watching this because it rhymes with something in your own life. If someone has told you that you are not family because you refuse to absorb their consequences, if the price of belonging was the surrendering of your own stability, your own ground, I want you to hear this clearly. That is not what family means. Family is not the people who claim you when it costs them nothing. Family is not the people who withdraw the word the moment you stop being useful. You are not less loved for having limits. You are not less loyal for protecting what you built. You are not less of a daughter, a son, a sibling, a person for saying no to something that would have undone you. And the ground you build in the years after that, no. The quiet, difficult, entirely yours ground, that is not consolation. That is the real thing. That is what it was always supposed to be. Thank you for staying here with me. If this landed somewhere true for you, leave a comment. Tell me where you are in it, before the no, after it, somewhere in the years between. I read every one. The next story is right below. See you there. There is one last thing I want to say because I think it is the most important, and I have been circling it. On the day my father said I was not family, I was 31 years old. I had $3,000 in savings, a stable job, a clean apartment, and a father who had just told me that my refusal to absorb his consequences made me not his. I could have changed my answer. In the days after the phone call, there were moments when the pull of it was real. Not because I thought it was right, but because the word family, used as a condition, is a powerful thing. It reaches somewhere that logic doesn't govern. I felt the pull of it. I did not change my answer. Not because I was strong in some uncomplicated way, because I had looked at what saying yes would have cost, and I understood that I was being asked to buy belonging at a price that would have left me too depleted to build anything at all. That the belonging being offered was not unconditional. It had a number attached to it, $74,000, and if I paid it, the number would be gone and I would be in debt, and the belonging would remain exactly as conditional as it had always been, just temporarily satisfied. That is what I understood at the kitchen table, that the condition would not be removed by meeting it. It would simply be replaced by the next one. So I said no, and I built the thing myself, and 5 years later, my father stood on the porch of it, and I opened the door, and whatever comes next will happen on ground that is entirely mine. That ground, that is the thing I want to leave you with, not the house. The ground. Build yours. Whatever it takes, whatever it costs in the short term, however long the years in the middle feel, build it. Because the people who come to your door will meet a different person than the one who would have said yes. And that person, the one standing on solid ground, is the one worth knowing.